In the brutal, unforgiving lands beyond Rome's eastern borders, where scorching winds carved through endless desert and silence carried the weight of death, one of the most powerful men in the world met an end so disturbing, it refused to be forgotten. This was not an ordinary execution. There were no swift blades, no merciful endings, no dignity. What happened to him was something far worse, because his death wasn't just punishment, it was a message crafted with precision, a message meant to echo across empires, and at the center of it all was gold. He had spent his entire life chasing it, not just collecting wealth, but worshipping it. Gold gave him influence, it gave him power. It allowed him to stand among Rome's elite without ever lifting a sword. While others earned glory through blood and battle, he built his empire through deals, manipulation, and opportunity. And for a time, it worked. He became richer than anyone else in Rome, richer than generals, richer than senators, richer than men whose names would live forever. But there was one thing his wealth could never buy: respect. Behind closed doors he was mocked, not openly, never openly, but quietly, subtly, because in a society that glorified conquest, strength, and battlefield dominance, he was seen as something lesser, a man of money, not a man of greatness. And that truth followed him everywhere. It lingered in the shadows of every victory he didn't win, every story that wasn't about him, every cheer that belonged to someone else, until eventually it became unbearable. Because no matter how much gold he accumulated, it was never enough. Not enough to silence the doubt, not enough to rewrite how the world saw him. And so he made a choice that would change everything. He would stop being the man who bought power and become the man who took it. But what he didn't realize was that the very thing driving him forward was also leading him straight to his end. Because greed doesn't just push men to succeed. Sometimes it pushes them too far. And when it does, it doesn't reward them, it destroys them. And in his case, it would destroy him in a way so symbolic, so horrifying, that even centuries later, the story still feels unreal. A man who lived for gold, forced to face it in its most terrifying form, not as wealth, not as power, but as death. And by the time it was over, Rome wouldn't just remember how he lived, they would remember how he died, because his ending wasn't just brutal, it was poetic, and it all began with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Long before his name became a warning, he was known for something entirely different. Not courage, not brilliance in war, but wealth on a scale Rome had never seen before. He didn't inherit a legacy of greatness. He built it, piece by piece, deal by deal. While others fought on distant battlefields, he stayed within the heart of Rome, mastering a different kind of warfare. One fought with contracts, influence, and calculated risk. When buildings burned, he saw opportunity. When others hesitated, he invested. When men fell into debt, he positioned himself to rise. He acquired land, businesses, and people. Yes, people. Entire fortunes were built on the backs of slaves, laborers, and those who had no power to resist. And he understood this system better than anyone. To him, everything had a price. And if it didn't, he would find a way to assign one. Over time, his wealth grew so vast that it became almost unimaginable. He could fund armies, sway political decisions, influence elections without ever stepping onto a battlefield. In many ways, he was more powerful than the generals themselves. But in Rome, power wasn't just about what you had. It was about what you had done. And that's where the problem began. Because while his fortune continued to grow, his reputation did not. He stood alongside men whose names were spoken with admiration, men who conquered lands, crushed enemies, and returned to Rome as heroes. Men who didn't just hold power, they earned it in the eyes of the people. And standing next to them, he felt invisible. Not because he lacked influence, but because he lacked legacy. No songs were sung about him. No victories were tied to his name. No soldiers told stories of following him into battle. He had everything a man could want, except the one thing he truly needed: respect. And the more he tried to ignore it, the louder it became. A quiet reminder that wealth alone could never make him great, that no matter how high he climbed, he would always stand in the shadow of men who had proven themselves in ways he never had. And over time, that shadow began to consume him, because for a man who had spent his life acquiring everything, there was one thing he could not buy, and it was the one thing he wanted most. At some point, the frustration stopped being quiet. It turned into something else, something heavier, something dangerous. Because the more he watched others rise through conquest, the more he began to believe that he had been left behind. And in Rome, being forgotten was worse than failure. So he made a decision, not out of necessity, but out of desperation. If respect could not be bought, then it would be taken. To the east, beyond Rome's borders, stood a powerful empire, rich, vast, and largely untouched by Roman dominance. Its lands controlled trade routes filled with silk, spices, and more wealth than even he could fully comprehend. But it wasn't just the riches that drew him in. It was what victory would mean. This was his chance to rewrite everything, to stand alongside the greatest men in Rome. Not as an equal in wealth, but as an equal in legacy. Advisors warned him. They told him the terrain was unforgiving, that the enemy fought differently, that this was not a war Rome could approach the same way. But he didn't want caution. He wanted glory, and glory doesn't wait. So he ignored them. He convinced himself that discipline, numbers, and Roman strength would be enough, just as they always had been. An army was assembled, tens of thousands of soldiers, experienced legions, cavalry, support units, a force large enough to intimidate, overwhelm, and conquer. Among them, his own son, a young man already proving himself in battle, strong, capable, and everything his father wished his own reputation reflected. This wasn't just a campaign anymore. It was personal. Together they would achieve what he never had. Together they would secure a legacy that would outlive them both. And as the army marched east, crossing into unfamiliar lands under a blazing sun, confidence filled the air. There was no fear, no hesitation, only expectation. Because in his mind, the outcome had already been decided. Victory was inevitable. Glory was waiting, and history was about to remember his name. But what he couldn't see, what he refused to see, was that every step forward was taking him deeper into a situation he didn't understand, a war he couldn't control, and a trap that had already begun to close around him. At first it didn't feel like defeat. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it unraveled, slowly, relentlessly. The enemy refused to fight the way Rome expected. They didn't charge. They didn't engage up close. They stayed just out of reach. Arrows rained down without warning, wave after wave, never stopping, never slowing. The sky itself seemed to turn against them as soldiers raised their shields, only to feel the constant impact of blows they couldn't return. Hours passed, exhaustion set in, frustration turned into fear, because no matter what they tried, They couldn't touch their enemy. Then came the breaking point. His son, leading a charge meant to turn the tide, pushed forward, chasing an enemy that seemed to retreat. But it was a lie, a calculated move. He was surrounded, cut off, and within moments, destroyed. When the news reached him, something inside him shattered. This was no longer about glory, no longer about legacy. It was survival. But even that hope was fading. The army began to break formation. Discipline collapsed. Panic spread faster than any command could control. Men who once marched with confidence now fought only to escape. And as night fell over the battlefield, the truth became undeniable. This was never going to be a victory. It was a disaster. And the man who had marched into this land seeking greatness was now trapped inside a nightmare of his own making. By the time it was over, there was nothing left of the man who had once commanded an army. No power, no pride, no control, only consequences. Captured by the very enemy he had underestimated, he was no longer seen as a general, or even as a threat. He was something else entirely, a symbol. To them, this wasn't just a victory on the battlefield. It was justice, because they understood exactly why he had come, not to defend, not to protect, but to take, driven by ambition, fueled by greed. And so, they chose not just to execute him, but to make an example out of him. They brought forth molten gold, the same substance that had defined his life. The same thing he had spent years chasing, building, and sacrificing everything for. Now, it would define his end. Held in place, with no escape and no voice left to bargain with. He was forced to face it, not as wealth, not as power, but as punishment. As the burning liquid was poured, his fate became more than death. It became a message that spread far beyond that battlefield, back to Rome, back to the men who once stood beside him, back to a world that believed wealth could conquer anything, because in that moment, it didn't. The richest man in Rome, undone not by his enemies alone, but by the very desire that led him there. And long after his name faded, the story remained. A reminder that greed doesn't just change a man, sometimes it writes the ending for him.